You're seeing tonight. Let's bring in Kmele Foster. He's the co-host of the Fifth Column podcast. Kmele, thanks so much for taking the time to join me tonight.
Ben, always good to talk with you, Ben.
We have a situation here that is incredible in terms of the reaction that it's spawned over the course of the past year. The death of George Floyd, obviously something that became not just a national story, but an international phenomenon in terms of reaction to it. What's your response to the verdict today?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that any time a civilian dies in the custody of law enforcement or in an interaction with law enforcement, particularly an unarmed civilian, that is a cause for concern. And in my experience, the overwhelming majority of the time that happens when someone who is working has made a mistake. And I don't think this case is an exception to that rule. On the other hand, I do think that this was a genuinely complicated case, and it is interesting that the jury returned a decision so quickly. I wasn't in the room. I listened to a lot of the evidence, but I don't know all of the facts of the case. But, you know, a circumstance where you don't have any physical evidence and you score, you know, sweeping kind of 3 convictions like this, that's an interesting outcome. I mean, in terms of the sort of national response to this, the real sort of quandary I have is for most Americans, when they look at this case and when they think about the facts of this case, it isn't obvious to me which facts make it clear, just self-evidently clear, that this is a case that was about race. It is entirely possible for people of all races and backgrounds to have bad outcomes in interactions with law enforcement, and I would say egregiously bad outcomes. I don't want to be sensationalist. That isn't what happens most of the time. Most police interactions they happen, and you're safe and you get home okay. But when things do go bad, that is important. The real question is, what do we do to prevent that? At the moment, people seem very interested in retribution. It isn't obvious to me that we're really having serious conversations about reform, and most of the conversations about racism, quite frankly, I think are people taking their eye off of the ball.
You know, you bring up an incredibly important point, which is that this story has been reflected through our media environment entirely through the lens of race, where Derek Chauvin is essentially a stand-in for every white American, George Floyd a stand-in for every black American. And to me, that's something that is designed to foment racial rage, outrage, and to, you know, really spread the kind of toxic environment that we've seen in recent years. What can be done to push back against that type of narrative, given the dominant force that the media has given this story through that lens?
I think what needs to happen is people try and speak honestly about these cases, take these cases as individual events, rather than linking them all together and insisting that George Floyd is Breonna Taylor, is Jacob Blake, is Dante Wright, is Adam Toledo. These are all distinct circumstances with very unique case evidentiary elements, and they need to be investigated and adjudicated on that basis, not linked together and turned into this sort of patchwork of, you know, racial justice, a very clear, self-evident narrative of the state persecuting black people, when in fact that's just not what's going on here. I think with the Adam Toledo case, to take the most recent example, you have a 13-year-old kid who is shot in an interaction with law enforcement. Under any circumstance, this is important and worth taking into consideration. The question is, should we be focusing narrowly on the last minute of his life, when in fact a police officer makes a split-second decision, and I mean split-second, to fire their weapon? Or should we be talking about why a 13-year-old is on the street at 2 o'clock in the morning?
I hate to stop you there, Kmele, but we're hearing from the Vice President and President Joe Biden.
Did mention earlier, but I'll reframe it here. The state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. That's police officers, the government has that. And it is appropriate for that reason to scrutinize the use of force by the state. It's important. It is uniquely problematic when civilians are killed in interactions with government agents. This is important to always keep at the forefront of our minds. I also think it's very important to keep things into perspective. And I think talking about people being perpetually afraid of being murdered on their way to the gas station or while they're shopping at the supermarket, effectively by members of law enforcement, that was the ostensible intimation on the part of the president during his remarks. And I just think that's absurd. I don't think people actually live in fear in that way. If we are, however, going to zoom in on a circumstance, we could take a look at the circumstance in Chicago. We could take a look at the Adam Toledo shooting, which a lot of people have been focusing on, and we could talk about the milieu that Adam Toledo comes out of. And that milieu is a city where 907 people have been shot since the beginning of this year. Those are war zone stats. We are talking about law enforcement, which is involved in a vanishingly small, relative to the number of interactions they have with civilians, number of shootings. Every one of those shootings matters. They're involved in some number of civilian deaths. Every one of those deaths matter. They all should be investigated impartially and thoughtfully, and we should pursue reforms to keep those numbers low. But if we're talking about these things in hyperbolic ways, and we're ignoring the actual circumstances that genuinely make people afraid to leave their houses in certain circumstances, the historic rises in murder rates in many cities in this country over the course of the last 12 months, in many respects connected directly to civil unrest that gripped the country during the wake of this, what's been described as a racial reckoning. I don't think we're being serious. We have to really scrutinize the forces that are at work here and the way that we're talking about race in this country. And I'm delighted to see some of the criminal justice reform efforts happen. I am very concerned about many of the ways that we're talking about race and the various cases in which it seems to be disconnected from the facts. There is, more than a year later, still no piece of evidence related to this particular case, the case of George Floyd being killed, that gives us an indication that if he were a white man and all other things were equal, he would be alive today. There just isn't. And that is absolutely critical for us to keep in mind.
And that's something that, unfortunately, I think our politicians are unfortunately unable to say, unable to come out and be honest about. Thank you so much, Kmele, for